one of the best qualities of leaders that I had in DOJ or in the Department of Defense was the people who, when they were in leadership positions, they didn't care about what the people above them thought. They cared about what the people below them thought. And that's antithetical to what you think of a leader, right? You're worried about, you would think, you're worried about advancing and getting promoted and like, what is your evaluation and your, review going to say that year? But the best and most effective leaders that I knew, they certainly respected their own superiors in the chain of command, of course, but they were really concerned about how everybody below them was doing, and how can they properly influence and direct and lead the people that were underneath them. And I think you have the inverse here. You have people that are in these leadership positions that don't really care what's going on with federal prosecutors. They don't care that agents are, that the morale of the FBI is completely decimated, or that agents are sort of put in greater risk because of leadership. These people that are in leadership now, they really only care about looking up. Who am I pleasing? There's one or two people above me for my own career that I would like to continue to appease in order to stay in this position. And it's just not really about, in these circumstances in the current cabinet, none of these people are there to lead the people that they're leading. They're there for their own gain, their own career. They don't really care about the people that they should be in charge of.
Welcome to Flourishing Leadership in Tough Times, where we have honest conversations to help you stay rooted with integrity, rise with courage, and lead with hopeful resilience. Hosted by Deborah Owen. Welcome, friend, to another episode of Flourishing Leadership in Tough Times. I'm Debbie Owen, your host, and I am very excited today to introduce you to Margaret Donovan. She is a former U.S. Army captain who served in the 101st Airborne Division and later in the 5th Special Forces Group as a judge advocate in the JAG Corps. She went on to serve as an Assistant U.S. Attorney for the District of Connecticut. She now teaches as a visiting lecturer at Yale Law School, where she focuses on issues of national security, civil-military relations, and the rule of law. Her recent public reflections on systemic accountability and moral courage have resonated widely, particularly in moments when democratic institutions feel strained, which I would say they do right now. And Margaret brings a rare combination of military experience, prosecutorial discipline, and legal scholarship to questions about leadership, integrity, and responsibility in complex systems. Welcome, Margaret. I'm really happy to have you with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that introduction.
Yeah. Well, leadership in calm seasons is one thing. Leadership when institutions feel strained and when trust is fragile, that's something else entirely. So I'm eager to have this conversation today because I think it's going to be more about that type of leadership. But before we talk about public leadership, I'd also love to begin somewhere a little more ordinary. And so when you first started out in the military, what were you thinking about leadership?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of what I learned about leadership, and I don't want to go so far as it's odd to characterize myself as a leader, and I'm totally flattered that you've invited me on this. And if that's the implication, that's wonderful. But it's not necessarily something I've ever considered. But what I did learn about leadership, I learned first from the military. And I think that you have a lot of exposure to different types of leadership. That's something that being an officer in the military, the Army or whatever branch you're in, really prides itself on instilling a sense of principles and character and sort of having a backbone in the United States, officers of the United States military. Mm-hmm. And that is a central characteristic of our military, that we pride ourselves on ethics and principles. So in that, you learn a lot of different styles of leadership. Some people are, very grand, right? They can make very sort of almost prominent or sort of, like I said, grand announcements of something, or they have a very good presence. They have a very sort of imposing presence that can capture the attention of a room as soon as they walk in. And those people are always amazing because you're sort of in awe of what they're doing and you're listening to them. And I think the military mostly defines leadership as the ability to influence people in some way. You could have leadership that is not so good. You could have
Hmm.
leadership where somebody in the military, if nowhere else, you can actually just be a leader by virtue of your rank and your position, right? But it doesn't mean that you inherently have leadership qualities. So when you're sort of a leader in name, but not in character or not in performance, I think you see leadership that does not inspire change and that sort of creates divisions and distrust and almost like a disloyal feeling among the people that are sort of subject to that leadership. And then you have more quiet leadership that I think if you if I had to categorize myself in like one of those three areas, I hope it's not the bad leadership, but also I would probably say that there are a number of people in my career that I just looked at as people who lead by example. And they may not be the people fighting to get their names in the headlines or put their name first on an important filing or sort of take the credit where there is credit to be taken. It's the people who just sort of quietly do their job and allow their work and their product and their sort of bearing and their presence speak for itself. And I have found that that type of leadership that I saw in the military and in the DOJ, for that matter, that is what sort of stuck with me the most. And I think you're absolutely right that it's totally different to talk about leadership in calm times. It's very easy to be a leader of a very well-running organization or a community that is not stressed out and panicked and becoming disconnected with itself. It's a lot more, it's a totally different ballgame. It's a lot different in times of trials and in tough times. So I think that you have this phenomenon happening right now where people are genuinely looking for leadership. I think that communities and the country as a whole, I think people are trying to find sources of leadership because there is a vacuum somewhere. And I'm comparing that, I guess, to my time in the military, where maybe you had a commander of a specific unit or a supervisor who was the type of leader that was not effective. Maybe he or she just didn't communicate clearly. Maybe he or she was just sort of a very harsh and unforgiving critic, or had whatever the characteristic is that made them a bad leader. You tend to just seek out, I think, naturally other forms of leadership. You try to find mentors, or you try to find people that you can look at and try to emulate. And I feel like, in my opinion, that that's kind of what's happening right now. You have people in government who are not leaders. And I can, I don't know how in detail you want me to get, but I can name a few names.
Sure, we could.
Yeah. So look, I mean, I'm going to use the DOJ as an example.
Okay.
Pam Bondi is not a leader, right? She has lost total control of the organization. She has people leaving in droves. It is a wildly disconnected Department of Justice. You have people saying one thing in one courtroom and another thing in another courtroom. The Department of Justice has lost its credibility in courtrooms across America. And to me, it is a leadership failure. One of the major storylines right now, as we sit here recording this, is that the DOJ has lost so many people that it is now trying to recruit from the Department of Defense to add JAG attorneys to sort of as a labor pool for the Department of
Wow.
Justice. And they are trying to recruit people through like, you know, basically social media direct messages, people posting things saying, send your application if you want to be as an assistant U.S. attorney. And these were really sought after jobs. It took me two applications. I mean, and just to put this in perspective, I was in 2018 when I was leaving the Army. I had done two combat deployments. I was a Bronze Star recipient. I had been a special assistant U.S. attorney in the Army, so I had done federal cases in federal court. And I didn't get in my first application. I had to apply twice
Wow.
to get into the Department of Justice. So, it was a very sought after position. And now we see um, this sort of degradation of the department where people are actually posting on X, send me your application through a direct message and we can see if we can get you a job. And it's because of poor leadership, in my opinion. It's because you don't have somebody at the top. You are losing cases, you're bringing bad cases. And this is happening because you have no ability to lead. Why, and certain items in the news, and I definitely am not interested in getting into this, but obviously there's a certain um, uh, person who was charged with pretty offensive
Yes.
charges and committed suicide in prison. And now there's all types of fallout from that.
Right.
And the idea that this entire sort of running storyline in the news about that case is totally the fault of Attorney General Bondi trying to, move too quickly, and she's not listening to her subordinates, and she's not bothering to learn the organization that she's in charge of. So I think that I went into a little bit of detail there, but
Mm.
broad strokes, I think when you have a government that people are used to looking at the leaders in government and they're used to saying, um, that's somebody I want to be like. That's somebody who, look at that person's career. Look at how sober and stoic and, unflappable this person is. That is typically somebody that, most of the American public looks at and respects and thinks, I want to be like that person. I want my kids to look at that person and think that's what an attorney general looks like. That's what the head of the FBI should look like. That's what the Secretary of Defense should look like. And we don't have those people. We have people who are just bombastic, do it for the gram online personalities. And those aren't leaders. Those aren't true leaders, in my opinion. And so
Yeah.
I think you have this effect of people kind of coming out of the woodwork and trying to share what they know. And so you mentioned my bio. This sort of odd thing is happening right now where everything in my background, I used to do airstrikes when I was in the Army. I deployed to 2 combat deployments and I did pretty much airstrikes the whole time when I was in Baghdad and when I was in Syria. And then I left the Army and I joined the Department of Justice. And in the Department of Justice, I was there during the January 6th attack. So I became involved in national security and domestic terrorism when
Mm.
I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office. And then I got out in 2024, right before the change of administration. And I'm in this sort of odd place right now with the news. Suddenly, how the United States does airstrikes is very relevant. Suddenly, how the Department of Justice conducts itself in a courtroom is in question and is newsworthy. So I'm in this sort of odd place where every otherwise unremarkable aspect of my prior career has suddenly become relevant. And so I guess what I'm trying to do with my media appearances and with what, I don't know, whenever I've been interacting on these issues, I'm just trying to be an ordinary voice, trying to remind people of what normal actually is, and trying to remind them that 2 + 2 doesn't equal 5. And just because these are your leaders doesn't mean you have to, um, look at them as examples. There are other people in America, there are other citizens, there are other leaders out there that Americans can look at and realize this is what America means. Maybe not them, but this is what America means. That we are still out there. Those leaders are still out there, I promise you.
Hmm. Hmm. I love what you just said about helping people realize that this is what ordinary is supposed to look like.
Yes,
You know, the what we're seeing is so out of the ordinary, so beyond what we were taught, I think, as we were growing up in terms of what are people supposed to do, how are we supposed to act, how are we supposed to have a moral compass, and what we're seeing is truly out of the ordinary. And that's interesting. I'm thinking about it now, and in terms of leadership and flourishing in leadership, we want to be able to, in order to flourish, we have to be able to count on what things are going to be to some extent. Would you agree with that?
totally. And I
Yeah,
think the other thing is like you have so many young people who are coming of age during this administration and
right.
who don't have the framework that you and I have of like, I remember when being in government was a very respectable position that you didn't like type horrendous things on social media as a government official. You didn't post death videos of strikes on social media. There was a time where decorum and stoicism and just sort of carrying yourself with some amount of dignity
Hmm.
was the norm in our leadership. And I think that's something that really did make America um, exceptional.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I think that there's a like an entire generation of people who don't have the framework of what ordinary is.
Yeah, yeah. And actually, as we were talking about before I hit record on this, the fact that we have our older son who did ROTC in the Navy, served on a submarine for 5.5 years, and he's now a Naval Reserve officer while he's working as an engineer. I mean, he grew up wanting to be a patriot.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I look at him now and I think I'm glad that you're not serving active duty right now because those would be hard choices.
It is, and it shouldn't be like that.
Hmm.
It shouldn't be that you are in government and you were wondering whether what you were doing is right. That you were
Yeah.
in the military and you were wondering whether or not the order that you're receiving is lawful. That you're in DOJ and you're wondering whether or not the case you're told to bring is constitutional. That has that should not be the experience of people in the United States. And it's not some grand conspiracy. Sometimes it's exactly what it seems like, which is that it is poor leadership who is not properly setting the example for other people.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and that kind of is a little bit of a segue to my original question. We've had a good sidebar already, but there are times when leaders find that loyalty and truth are at odds with each other.
Yeah.
So your experiences in the Army and the Department of Justice may be unique, but that concept of that that tension between loyalty and truth isn't necessarily unique to your position, for instance. So how do you respond when loyalty and truth begin to diverge?
Yeah, I think, I'll put my former prosecutor hat on for this
Sure.
answer, but I think that one of the most amazing things about working for the Department of Justice is that your goal at the end of the day is not to win. Your goal is to bring justice to the case.
Mm.
And justice takes many forms. Sometimes justice is the case goes forward and somebody can make a showing that the evidence is not enough or a warrant gets suppressed. And that's where the facts fall. But you have brought the case righteously and in good faith. And so it was kind of a nice aspect. I mean, it was probably the best aspect of the job was that loyalty and truth really typically were not in tension. If you found the truth that you weren't supposed to bring a case, you actually had an obligation if the case was live to disclose it.
Mhm.
It's called a Brady obligation if you're a prosecutor. And before you brought it, you had an obligation to be totally candid and frank with your supervisors to say, I don't think we have a case here. And what you're seeing now is when people are doing that, they're being fired for doing that.
Yeah.
So that is, I enjoyed my time at the Department of Justice because that was never in conflict.
Mhm.
Loyalty and truth, whenever those sort of butted up against each other, truth would win out because being loyal, or I'm sorry, being truthful was being loyal.
Yeah.
Being candid about what the facts of the case were was being loyal to the concept of justice.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then I guess I'll put on my former JAG officer hat here. A lot of what you're doing as a JAG officer is earning the trust of the commander that you're with when you're giving advice, whether it's on something as lethal and irreversible as an airstrike, or whether you're just giving advice on, a random disciplinary issue in the unit that you're in. And so for a commander to trust you, you really have to build up your credibility there. And in my experience, part of building up that credibility was sort of sharing cold hard truths when you needed to. Making sure that the commander knew that I wasn't just going to be a yes man or a yes woman, that I was going to tell him or her, when something, in my opinion, was not advisable. So I think that, loyalty, again, in service of the chain of command and in service of actually helping the military further its mission, loyalty was telling the truth.
Yeah.
Loyalty was not hiding the truth and not trying to say, yeah, I don't think there's any legal issues at all with this strike because I know that that's what the command wants, and I'm trying to express my loyalty to the mission. My loyalty to the mission is keeping it legal on all fours and properly justified.
Mhm. Hi, thank you for letting me interrupt this episode for just a moment. Now, if you're listening to this podcast, the chances are you care deeply about leading well, especially in times that feel heavy or uncertain or demanding. One of the convictions behind this podcast is that flourishing leadership doesn't start with strategy. It starts with who you're becoming as a leader, under pressure, in grief or sorrow, in change or transformation. And that's why I've been writing a series of devotional books called The Awaiting for Advent. and When Sorrow Speaks for Lent. They're grounded in neuroscience, the personality patterns of the Enneagram, and reflective practice to help you grow in awareness, self-honesty, and presence. And while they do follow the rhythms of the church year, they're really for any season when leadership feels costly. They're resources you can return to whenever you want to lead from the inside out. Not just do more or say more, but become more of who you were created to be, more grounded, more whole. So please see the show notes for links to these resources and share them with your friends. Thanks. And now back to this episode. Do you think that there's, either from your experience or from seeing other people, is there a cost sometimes to speak publicly? What's the cost at this point in
Well,
time?
yeah, I mean, look at what's happening with Senator Mark Kelly, right? I
Right.
mean, like you have people who is a complete leader, by the way, and that's a great example of somebody who, I wasn't totally plugged into the senators of Arizona before
Yeah.
2025.
Yeah.
But now all of a sudden people are looking at him like a symbol, like an icon of, this is how you stand up to government overreach. This is how you make sure that you stand up for what is right. And I don't think it's any coincidence his career has a significant military accomplishments and accomplishments in service to the government as an astronaut. So I think that that's a great example of what happens when you speak out and you sort of see the consequences of it. I mean, to me, I have noticed since this administration has taken over in the legal world, there are firms that you would think would be sort of titans of the legal community. And those firms have totally backed away from taking on cases that in any other environment, they probably would have said is a righteous case and is something that they can throw their significant resources behind in the service of democracy. And what I have seen disappointingly is that many of these firms have chosen not to speak out and that they are shrinking from that role.
Mhm.
So there are consequences, but I feel like that is where leadership is really tested and sort of forged is what is leadership? As you said at the very beginning, what is leadership when everything is calm, when there's no consequences for what you say? I think the real test is when the rubber hits the road and when you do hit some friction, what do you do then?
Yeah.
Does Mark Kelly just say, sorry, I won't say anything anymore? I guess I'll just, I'll stay out of the headlines for now. Or do you dig in and stand up for what you believe in? And so I think it's the people who are doing the latter that are doing a real service to the country.
Yeah, and that goes to integrity.
Yes.
And when something is integrated, it means it's of a whole. And so in order for us to be whole, we have to have the integrity between head, heart, and gut and be able to embody the values and the beliefs that we believe are important.
Yeah.
And that's what integrity is all about. And so he's a prime example, I think you're right, of somebody who is full of integrity, because if he didn't stand by what he believes, then he wouldn't feel whole.
Yeah, and that's, part of what I imagine when I see whether it's Cash Patel or Hegseth or Bondi or Blanche or any of these people, you look at them and you think, nobody ever gave you like a value system. Like, or if they did, they didn't give it to you in a permanent enough way because they're performing and they're acting in a way that doesn't really stand up for anything, that doesn't show any integrity, except sort of like a blind loyalty, without any dissent and without any sort of self-awareness or assertion of principles.
Mhm.
So it does strike me that, like I said, it's no coincidence that whether it's, Mark Hertling, who's been speaking out a lot, whether it's other former judge advocate generals, other former JAG officers who have similarly been sort of taking a stand and going and speaking to the media and trying to educate the public on the issues of what's going on with the military, whether it's Senator Mark Kelly or the other five lawmakers. I think it's no coincidence that like a lot of these people have a military background, or something that, very intentionally and forcefully instilled this value system. And in a way, now that we're talking about that, I'm just thinking it's almost like the United States was protecting itself from itself. Like
Yeah.
all of that was instilled in these people and in these leaders by the United States. That was a core value of the military. If you listen to Hegseth's speeches now, he doesn't talk about ethics. He doesn't talk about principles. He doesn't talk about honor. None of that matters. The
Mhm.
only thing that matters is lethality and images and what he can post on his X account.
Yeah.
So it's sort of a funny circumstance that like what the United States had already instilled in other leaders is now suddenly coming up and in to the surface to sort of contest what is happening right now in the leadership.
Yeah. That is so interesting. So it's there, it's in the water, so to speak.
Yeah,
It's in the water, and we just have to hope that even the young people who are entering the military now will still be able to drink that same water and get that. And not
yeah,
just military people. I mean, it's our young people in high schools, the young people that you're teaching in college.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, completely. I mean, I think like one of the best qualities of leaders that I had in DOJ or in the Department of Defense was the people who, when they were in leadership positions, they didn't care about what the people above them thought. They cared about what the people below them thought. And that's antithetical to what you think of a leader, right? You're worried
mhm.
about, you would think, you're worried about advancing and getting promoted and like, what is your evaluation and your, review going to say that year? But the best and most effective leaders that I knew, they certainly respected their own superiors in the chain of command, of course, but they were really concerned about how everybody below them was doing
Right.
and how can they properly influence and direct and lead the people that were underneath them. And I think you have the inverse here. You have people that are in these leadership positions that don't really care what's going on with federal prosecutors. They don't care that agents are, that the morale of the FBI is completely decimated or that agents are sort of put in greater risk because of leadership. These people that are in leadership now, they really only care about looking up. Who am I pleasing? There's one or two people above me for my own career that I
Mhm.
would like to continue to appease in order to stay in this position. And it's just not really about in these circumstances in the current cabinet. None of these people are there to lead the people that they're leading. They're there for their own game, their own career. They don't really care about the people that they should be in charge of.
So it's a very self-centered type of leadership as opposed to a responsibility type of
Yes.
leadership where you were just describing taking care of the being responsible, feeling responsible for the people that you're actually leading
Yes.
and not responsible to the people, or you are, but less important is being responsible to the people who have power over your career.
Yeah, I think it's like, making sure that you're taking care of your flock, for lack of a better word,
Right,
than
right.
to, worry about your own position as, making sure that you advance to be the next highest ranked shepherd, so to speak. So
Yeah.
it's it's uh it's just disappointing. And again, I think that that's why people are seeking out leaders from other sources, whether
Mm,
it's people who have left the government and are now speaking publicly, whether it's people within the legislature that are speaking out against the executive branch when other members of the legislature will not.
mhm,
And
mhm.
it's just sort of a necessary characteristic of any society that people will gravitate towards some type of leadership. And I think that what we're seeing is natural leaders starting to sort of come out of the woodwork in a time of crisis.
Oh, I love that. I love that. So, kind of let's go into what does it mean to flourish as a leader? Especially, we talked about when it's calm, that's a lot easier. But when you're in the middle of whatever the battle might be, and in this case, it's kind of a political battle. Although sometimes ask the people of Minneapolis, it's a street battle too.
Yeah.
But when you're in the middle of a battle, how do you flourish? How do you flourish when you're in the midst of something like that?
That's a hard question because I don't know that I'm not sure if I've been able to identify a moment of flourishing.
Okay.
But I think, to me, flourishing is maintaining almost. It's maintaining a sense of calmness and stability
Mm.
and setting that example for other people and letting other people know that it's going to be okay. And um, your first instinct may be to panic in a scenario. And I can take whatever experience I've had in my strike cells where we think a strike went wrong or something is happening that urgently needs a response from the strike cell.
Mhm.
And I think that in those instances, flourishing to me is maybe different than like the actual definition of the word because it's not like I said my style throughout my career has not been command the room and announce what we're doing, and my
Right.
style has just been maintain some amount of sort of poise and sobriety really, and make sure that people understand that if they need sort of a calm stable source of advice, I can be there to give that to them.
Mhm.
um, and I also think, and this is, I think, part of what we've talked about before. I think that having like a very strong faith in something, whether it is a specific sect of religion or whether it is other set of principles, it's just helpful to have something to sort of come back to uh,
Mm.
in those difficult times. There's this
Mhm.
saying that there are no atheists in foxholes. So I think that when you're in these very difficult positions, people tend to, automatically revert back to whatever faith system that they have.
Mhm.
And I think to me, it's helpful to sort of draw from that before you have to sort of be in that foxhole and revert
Right.
back to it. Does that
Right.
make sense?
Yeah, yeah. You want to have a practice of being connected to whatever experience
Yeah,
of God that you have, so that when push comes to shove, it's not like who is this God person that I've never talked to before?
completely. Yes. And I've tried, without getting too personal, but in my own experience, I've, had moments where you have to sort of come back to that. And maybe you haven't been as present in your faith as you should have been or you would have liked to be. And you have to sort of find your way back to that. And I've found now I'm at a point in my career and in my age, I guess, that I can sort of identify ahead of time. I'm going to need to fortify myself a little bit for
Mm.
this next mission or this next, circumstance that I'm going to find myself in. And I'm going to try to fortify my faith a little bit more before I go into it so that I'm not caught, sort of sending a Hail Mary, literally,
Yeah, literally.
for whatever I'm doing.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's important to know that we're not alone when the times are hard.
Yes. Yeah. And it's nice to just sort of go into that. And so I think, I don't know if there are statistics on this, but it strikes me that this may be a moment in the country where people are turning back to those institutions and again, trying to find a sense of community where everything feels disconnected, trying to find a sense of leadership and stability where things seem volatile and unpredictable.
Mhm.
And whether it's the church, whether it's civic organizations, whether it's just family, whether it's just sort of touching base with family and making sure everybody's okay. For me, part of what I've been doing as well is sort of reaching out to former mentors and leaders that I knew in the military that I deployed with. And I
Mm.
stay in touch with them anyway, but particularly since this administration has taken over, it struck me that it is really important to have those networks and to maintain those relationships with leaders and mentors. Mentorship is just such a huge part, I think, of being a leader, of having a mentor to talk to, either formally or just privately. And so I have made it a point to just reach back out to those mentors over this past year,
Yeah.
and just remind yourself of again, what does normal look like? We can't normalize indecency. We shouldn't normalize cruelty. And I think that, you know, reaching back out to leaders throughout your life, for
Mhm.
me, that's been a helpful tool to have that touch point.
I love that. And that wasn't even something I was thinking about. I'm wondering if you could say just a little bit more about mentorship for you being mentored, but also your position of being able to mentor. And what does that mean in terms of thriving and flourishing for people in leadership roles?
Yeah, I mean, I think mentorship is something that didn't dawn on me until probably like maybe halfway through my Army career that I realized I was developing mentors, of sort of gravitating towards people.
Hmm.
One piece of advice that I got was whenever you enter a new environment, whether it's you just got assigned to a new unit or you're just starting a new job, or maybe you're just moving to a new school, something like that, identify who the people are that you look up to. Identify who you think carries themselves respectfully and with treats people with kindness and whatever it is that you value. And then just try to emulate them. Just try to see what they do and what their practices are and get to know them. And so I think there's sort of an informal and organic way that you can sort of gravitate towards mentors. And then sometimes you have organizations that actually formally assign you to somebody, right? So when I joined DOJ, I had a mentor formally assigned to me. The Army sometimes does pairings like that.
Hmm.
But either way, whatever you can sort of glean from that, I just think it is completely invaluable to have a mentor there. And for example, the woman that I worked for when I was in the military, when I was in the JAG Corps, neither of us are in the JAG Corps anymore. And so just naturally, we fell out of touch for a few years because we were in different jobs. And it struck me as this administration was sort of turning things upside down and left is right and up is down and 2 + 2 = 5, that I needed that touch point. I needed to go back to somebody who was my source of stability in tough times and see what she was doing and how she was coping with it.
Hmm.
And so that has been really useful. And because I value it so much, I try to do it for whether it's my students, whether it's junior officers who were sort of a few ranks or a few rotations behind me in the JAG Corps, whether it's interns that work here at my law office here. I always try to take time for mentorship. And that's something that my husband gets at me endlessly about because there's always only so many hours in the day.
Hmm.
And he kind of rolls his eyes and I'm like, well, I'm meeting with a student. I'm going to go have coffee with so and so.
Yeah.
Because it's like, you never have time for that, right? Like if you really
Right.
think about your life, like it's so easy to say, like, I just don't have time. This is not, I have a deadline. I have this, I have that. But I have tried really hard ever since I first started working with universities when I did an intern program when I was in the JAG Corps and I worked with interns when I was at the Department of Justice. I've tried really hard to always say yes when people ask me to go to coffee or to just to meet and talk or to have a Zoom call or phone call or career advice. I have tried very, very hard, no matter what my schedule is, to try to fit it in, even if it's at like 10 p.m. at night, if it's on a weekend, if my kids are screaming in the background, because I just know how important that is. And if I can someday be that source of stability to any of these younger people throughout their careers, I would be honored because I know in what regard I hold my own mentors.
Yeah, yeah, I really love that a lot. I'm wondering if you could zero in. We're going to wrap up here in a minute, but I'm
Sure.
wondering if you could zero in on mentoring and mentorship with women in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I have tried to not, it just sort of happened like that. My mentors in the military all happened to be women. And I haven't like really, I have to say, like, I would get invited to groups, women in the military or whatever. And I always used to sort of shun them because I would think, I don't feel different. I mean, like, I'm in here because we're all the same. And I'm not some special
Okay.
class of soldier or officer. I'm just an officer.
Hmm.
And I think many of my mentors felt the same way, that they didn't need to have some special group or some special treatment. However, in recent time, I have seen sort of what is happening to the role of women in the military. I think that's been pretty expressed, women in combat roles, women in the military at all. I've seen the way that whether or not there are certain roles that people believe that women should play and they shouldn't, they are playing or they're not playing enough. Um, and specific to women in the military, within the past year, I've been thinking like, man, there should be like groups dedicated to women veterans and women in the military. Like, sure enough, it's those same communities and those same groups that, like, at the time when I was in the military, I was sort of like, I don't need these, everything's fine. And I didn't realize that, like, someday everything won't be fine. And someday people actually will be targeting. women in the military. And it turns out that those communities really are useful and important. But I think that I've gravitated towards women leaders just because they are good leaders. And I think that particularly in the military, I think that there's a lot less room for, I'm trying to say this carefully, I think that there's a lot less room for women to sort of shy away from anything. There's a lot less room for women to sort of be less serious about the job. And let me try to rephrase that. I think that you have less flexibility with trying to, for example, crack jokes or be relaxed or lighthearted. And that's not to say that like women officers have to like overcorrect and overcompensate. But I do think that like in times where I've found myself, and I've sort of learned this from my mentors, if you are in a position where you are giving a very serious legal opinion or you are expected to deliver some very sort of grave or otherwise sober news, I've just found that it's easier to just default to having a very serious approach to that, as opposed to maybe a relaxed, chummy, I'm just one of the guys approach. And if it comes off as being too serious, that is a much less concerning of a sin than coming off as being not serious enough, in my opinion. So, yeah.
That's, you stated your words carefully, but I think we get the picture. So thank you for sharing that. Is there anything from this conversation, either from this conversation that you really want to kind of double down on, or something that we didn't get to that you really want to share in terms of how do we flourish in these tough times and when we're in leadership roles?
I would just keep coming back to what we talked about at the very beginning, which is that somebody can be in a leadership position, but that doesn't make them a leader. And I think that that is one of the foundational beauties of democracy, is that you can identify your own leaders and then you can elevate those people into positions of leadership. And I guess I would just urge people listening to this to identify your own leaders. It does not have to be the people that are in the cabinet right now. It doesn't have to be the people that are in office. It is okay to not accept their standard as your standard. And you can find people that truly represent you and make them your leaders in this country, which is an amazing thing.
Find people to look up to who have the values and beliefs that you that are full of integrity for where you are.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you so much, Margaret. This has been such a great conversation. I really appreciate your spending time with us. And yeah, thank you. The best to you and all that you're doing and all the people that you're influencing and impacting. So thank you so much.
No, thank you for having me. It was great.
Okay, great. Thanks for joining me on Flourishing Leadership in Tough Times. If you found today's conversation meaningful, please like and share this episode and subscribe for more honest, inspiring stories to help you stay rooted with integrity, rise with courage, and lead with hopeful resilience. If you have thoughts or questions, or you're interested in finding out about coaching, spiritual direction, or retreat leadership, I'd love to hear from you. Please reach out through Substack or from my website at insideoutministries.info. I'm Deborah Owen, and I'll see you next time.